Hey everybody, this is the Catholic Esquire. I just finished producing about a 35-minute detailed video explaining the Beneplentist argument, the argument that Pope Benedict never resigned in February 2013, and because of that, there was never a valid conclave that elected Francis, and therefore Francis to this day is not and has never been Pope. I did a 35-minute detailed video on that. It's still a summary, but I got into more detail where I show you the actual text of the resignation and go through that a little bit line by line and to show you what the argument is, the Beneplentist argument. I wanted to do a short video, even a shorter one, to give you the highlights, to give you the basic argument, lay it out hopefully in 10 to 12 minutes for you, just so you're educated on the topic, because as chaos continues in the Vatican, more and more talk is going to come up about how could a man such as Jorge Mario Bergoglio be Pope. It's a good question. So, to get to the bottom of the argument, the idea here is that Benedict never actually resigned the office of the papacy, nor did he have the intent of resigning the office of the papacy. Now, he gave a speech in February 2013. The speech was in Latin. It was drafted originally in Latin. And so, after it all was said and done, everything we saw was the English translation. I think it was Latin, it got translated to Italian, then it got translated to English. Problem with that is that when you look at the text of the actual portion of his speech where he resigns, or is said to have resigned, he used a word in Latin that he did not use at the beginning of the exact same speech for what appeared to be talking about the papacy. In the English translation, and I think it's pretty accurate there, it keeps being translated as the Petrine ministry. Well, Benedict used two different words to distinguish between the office of the papacy and the functions, the duties of that office. The office is the munus, the duties and functions is the ministerial. He distinguished between that in the text of his own speech. Now, a lot of people make a big deal about that because they say, oh, well, in Latin, those words can be sometimes used interchangeably, blah, blah, blah. Look, people, it doesn't matter what people on the streets of Rome could have or did use when they interchanged these words. What matters is how these words are used in canon law. I have a lot of great respect for Benedict XVI. I think he was a smart man. I don't think he was sloppy. I don't think he was lazy, especially when it came to one of the most important events in the church in the last 500 years since the last pope resigned. So I assume he was very careful in the words that he chose. And at the beginning of his speech, he referred to the office of the papacy, the Petrine ministry as the munus, and then he started breaking it down into different functions, the governing function, the suffering function, the teaching function. He started breaking it down and saying, look, this Petrine ministry includes all of these different jobs, right? Which is true. The papacy does include different functions. And by the time he got to the point in his resignation where he says, I am hereby resigning, he used the ministerio word instead of the munus word. In other words, he was saying, I'm resigning the function of the Petrine ministry. And if you look in context, he was talking about the governance, right? The governance, the active portion of the papacy. If there was any question about what he was doing on February 28th, of the same month that he reportedly resigned, he explained in his audience. He said, look, the always is also forever. I'm resigning now the active ministry of the Petrine ministry, and I'm remaining in a new way, in a passive way, in prayer, suffering. And so you see, he's distinguishing this for what appears would be an odd thing, but I'll get to that in a minute why it's not as odd as you may think. He's saying, look, I'm giving up. I can't do the planes. I can't do the travel. I can't do all that stuff that popes are supposed to do. So I'm giving that up, and I'm going to remain in the enclosure of St. Peter, he says, which he did remain in the Vatican physically. and I'm going to stay in a new way, right? A new way. Why is it new? Again, I'm not sure. We've had popes resign before. He made it seem like whatever he was doing was new. Well, it was. And that's the problem. Clearly, what Benedict was doing here, if you read the text of his speech, but you have to read the Latin part and understand. That's the thing. If you just read the English of the text of his resignation, it's not going to be obvious, which is part of the problem and why people didn't pick up on this right away. But when you read the text of his audience the same month, he makes it much more clear. If there was still any doubt, 3 years later, his own secretary, Archbishop Ganswein, George Ganswein, reaffirmed what Benedict was saying in his audience. He's saying, no, he's staying in a new way. You know, we're looking at this Petrine ministry in a new way now. And so he confirmed what Benedict was saying. Now, again, if there's still any questions about what was happening, just look at what Benedict did after February 2013. He remained dressing in white. He continued to call himself Pope. He says he's Pope Emeritus. He continued to sign his name as Benedict. He continued to use the PP after his papal name, which stands for Pastor of Pastors. That's a papal signature. And he continued to give apostolic blessings. That's only popes can do that. So clearly there's a disconnect, right? If he truly resigned the office of the papacy, there's clearly a disconnect between what he was doing and what was purportedly said. But as I just pointed out, he did say what he was doing. He's giving up the active, the administrative, the governing part of the ministry, but he's retaining this other part of this overall expanded Petrine ministry. And this gets to my final part for today. What is going on here? The only way to understand this is through the lens of modernism. You know, as much as we may like Benedict, he was a man of the Council, the Second Vatican Council. He very much was part of modernist circles back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. No one denies that. And during that time, there was much talk, much discussion, and papers published about this notion of we need to start looking at changing what it means to be a pope. And this is where this concept of Petrine ministry comes in. You'll notice before the Second Vatican Council, that phrase wasn't really used. That's because it's a new phrase that's been redefined by modernism. And if this should not shock you. I mean, modernism has done with this with almost everything in the church. A similar example of this is the Paschal Mystery. They take this phrase that sounds Catholic and they turn it into this whole other thing. They distort it and change it to keep the veneer of Catholicism, but then change the substance. Well, there was a whole circle of modernists who were trying to do this with the papacy. And the reason was because they thought the papacy was an obstacle to ecumenism. We all know that modernists love ecumenism. It was a barrier for the Lutherans and Anglicans. Well, yeah, no kidding, right? So the idea was that, okay, we're going to view the papacy in a totally different way. We're not going to keep it to this limited, narrow, juridical governing office type of thing. It's going to be this bigger concept. And to help us understand this, a man by the name of J. Michael Miller, who's now an archbishop, he wrote a dissertation on this in 1980. And he highlights the whole argument. He makes the argument. He says, look, we got to stop looking at this papacy just like it's this governing, juridical, old-fashioned view. And if we take an expanded view of this, the Lutherans and Anglicans say they can go along with that. Because clearly Peter was given special preference by Christ. What the Anglicans and Lutherans didn't like was the idea of having one man as a supreme authority over the entire church, a governing authority, a juridical authority. They didn't like that. That was the obstacle. And so how do you fix that? Without totally just being obvious and destroying Catholicism right up front. You change the definition of what it means to be a pope, and you create this concept of Petrine ministry. Well, this is what Benedict was talking about in his resignation speech. And what he's saying is, it's like, look, the papacy is so much bigger than just governing. It's all these other things. And so I'm going to give up the governing part. We'll give that to somebody else. Yes, you have to call it conclave because We still need someone to be called Pope and to be governing, so you can call a conclave. And that's what he said. And that's what they did. The problem with it is that all of this is contrary to divine law and Catholic teaching. You can only have one Pope, all right? You can't have two members of a Petrine ministry. Number one, this concept of Petrine ministry is foreign to Catholicism. But number two, having two members of this Petrine ministry is totally non-Catholic. You can't do it. But that's what he was resigning, supposedly, in February of 2013. And so to conclude, Benedict didn't resign the papacy as we know it. He resigned the active component, the governing component of an expanded Petrine ministry. But even if he, let's just say, put aside this munus ministerium debate, which it really isn't a debate if you understand canon law. It's very clear how those terms are used in canon law. Even if you put that aside, he didn't have the intent. He didn't have the intent to do what we thought would normally happen, and that is resign in total the office of the papacy. He had a different intention. It was in substantial error. You can't do it. But in modernist worldview, this seems possible. And so, because it was a substantial error, canon law, specifically Canon 188, provides that any such resignation made under the pretense of substantial error, or if your intention is clouded by substantial error, it's null and void by law itself. That means it never took place from day one. If that's the case, Benedict never validly resigned the papal office, obviously then any conclave called after that was invalid. I think almost everybody agrees that conclaves cannot be called while you still have an active live pope running around. And so it doesn't really matter how many bishops or cardinals think Francis is pope. If the conclave itself was invalid and never took place officially, it doesn't matter what happened there, and it doesn't matter what they decided, because Benedict was always still the pope. And this is why this whole notion of universal acceptance, while most of the bishops think, it doesn't matter. It does not matter. Because no matter how many bishops or cardinals can get together, they can't just depose because they want to a pope, and they can't just decide for themselves that they want to have somebody else at any time. There has to be a vacancy first, and then you call a conclave. That's, in a nutshell, the Beneplentist argument. Like I said, I do have a more detailed video coming out as well, where we get into more details of the text of the resignation, munus ministerio difference, why it matters, and some of this history of modernism that is an important background to understand, so you understand Benedict's motivations better. I hope this video is helpful. Please share this if you think it's useful. Um, Even if people disagree with it, at least it's an educational opportunity, so at least you know what the hell the Beneplentists are talking about. Because there's a lot of disinformation out there, and I'm hoping to correct that. Thanks a lot. God bless. Have a great day.